Here's a question worth considering. Is it possible that God is evil? Alternatively, is it possible to say that this world that we live in was created by an evil force? According to the standard orthodox interpretations of Christianity, Judaism, the answer to that question is no. The assumption of most monotheistic religions is that God is infinitely good and that God created our universe. However, this wasn't always so obvious. And if we look back at the history of religion and the history of theology, we can see that there's actually debate about this topic and there are different ideas about this topic. The oldest religion that's still practiced today, that was practiced continuously throughout its existence, is Zoroastrianism. The Zoroastrian theological texts predate the Old Testament. Zoroastrianism and its ideas and theology and even its rituals have had a huge influence on all of the world's, or at least many of the world's, largest, most popular religions today. In the Zoroastrian cosmology, the universe was created in 7 stages, and in each stage there was a creation by a good deity, this benevolent deity, and there was a parallel opposing creation by an evil deity. In Zoroastrian theology, there are 2 gods, one is good and one is evil. In the Old Testament, similarly, there's also a 7-stage creation, just like in Zoroastrianism. But the 7-stage creation in the Bible is created by one God who is said to be good. And his creation, at the end of each day, we're told that what he created was good. As Judaism and Christianity evolved and developed over the centuries, there was this idea of a devil which emerged and became refined. And there's always been strands within Christianity, within Judaism, of a particular kind of heresy. And by heresy, I just mean ideas that aren't accepted as orthodoxy, that are sort of outside the mainstream. This idea that the world is a creation of a demiurge, of an evil spirit. These ideas are often referred to as Gnosticism. We can even get a taste of this Gnostic conception of the divine in the Old Testament, in the Bible. This episode and these verses were not emphasized in my own religious education, in my own Jewish education, but I think if we want a complete conception of the Bible and a complete conception of the theological questions that the Bible grapples with, these verses are incredibly important. So this is reading from Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 to 26. I'll first read the Hebrew, then the English. Vahi baderech b'malon vayifgeshuhu Adonai vayivakesh l'hamito. And it came to pass by the way in the inn that the Lord met him in this case is Moses, and sought to kill him. Batikach Zipporah tsar v'tichrat et orlat bena v'tigal l'raglav v'tomar ki chatan damim atali. Vayereth mimenu azamra chatan damim lamulot. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, "Surely a bloody husband art thou to me." So he let him go. Then she said, "A bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision." End quote. This is certainly a shocking episode, and it raises questions about where evil comes from in the theodicy, in the theological universe of the Bible. Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian opens with 3 epigraphs, and I want to look at those now. The first epigraph I want to read is the 3rd one in the book, because I think it's the most simple and easiest to understand. Quote, Clark, who led last year's expedition to the Afar region of northern Ethiopia, and UC Berkeley colleague Tim D. White, also said that a re-examination of a 300,000-year-old fossil skull found in the same region earlier shows evidence of having been scalped. The Yuma Daily Sun, June 13th, 1982. So it's not a very complicated epigraph. It's not so difficult to understand why Cormac McCarthy seized on this and wants to highlight this for us. If you go online and search for the Yuma Daily Sun archive, you can find this particular article where this quote was pulled from. And basically the message here in this quote, and the message of the article, is that when we look back and we find man's earliest relative, our first ancestor, going back 300,000 years, there's evidence that he was scalped. So there's evidence of violence, of this grotesque violence. There's evidence that it is something which is so basic to human nature and to the human experience. And so, of course, Blood Meridian, which is a book about a lot of violence, includes a lot of scalping. It's relevant information to know that this has been going on for a long time, that this is not something new in the human experience. Now, we can look at the first epigraph. Quote, "Your ideas are terrifying, and your hearts are faint. Your acts of pity and cruelty are absurd, committed with no calm, as if they were irresistible. Finally, you fear blood more and more, blood and time." Paul Valéry. So Paul Valéry is a French philosopher. He was writing around the 1900s, early 1900s. This is from an essay of Valéry's where he creates a conversation between a European person and a Chinese scholar. The part of this quote that really speaks to me, this, "You fear blood more and more, blood and time," it makes me think about the history of colonialism and the history of imperialism in the West. There's a pattern, I think, that we can see in history. If you look at the colonial projects that were done in Africa in the 1900s, if you look at colonialism in India in the 1900s, even if you look at America's Vietnam War, if you look at the Iraq War, and there are many other examples of history like this, we see a pattern. There's a pattern where a very powerful nation, an empire, seeks to go on this excursion to conquer, to subdue, to occupy a colony, what they perceive as being sort of a backwards nation. And there's so much optimism, there's such high expectations. There's the sense that the backward nation is surely going to be grateful to be occupied by the occupier because they're so backwards. There's a sense that the backwards people can't rule themselves, they can't govern themselves because they're so backwards. And this so advanced, technologically advanced, spiritually advanced empire is going to bring salvation and bring modernity to these people, and it's going to be a wonderful thing. As time goes on, inevitably the empire learns that the colony does not like to be colonized. The colony does not like to be occupied. And the empire learns that they meet resistance, that it doesn't go well. And the longer that they're there, the more they occupy it, the harder it is to leave, because more of a mess they make, and they become sort of stuck. And it becomes a terrible situation for the occupied, for sure, because they're being occupied by this racist, oppressive force. But also the empire becomes very fearful of the colony because they know that they learn that the colony is surprisingly resilient. Again, you saw this in Vietnam, the expectation that it was going to be such an easy war, they would just be bombed into submission, was totally wrong. And the experience of the soldiers who were in Vietnam was one of perpetual fear and terror of the Viet Cong. And so the sense that the empire fears blood and time, because there's this sense of precariousness, there's this sense that it can't last. Blood Meridian is very much a book about empire. It's about America's imperial colonial projects in the West and in Mexico, conquering land, killing the Native Americans there. And so this critique of the West, is very apt here, and it's psychologically accurate. The second epigraph is the last one that we haven't read yet, and it reads as follows, quote, "It is not to be thought that the life of darkness is sunk in misery and lost as if in sorrowing. There is no sorrowing, for sorrow is a thing that is swallowed up in death, and death and dying are the very life of the darkness." Jacob Boehme. So this is a really difficult quote to understand. Jacob Boehme was a German philosopher who lived in the early 1600s, and he's associated with a very late kind of Christian Gnosticism. His books were censored. He was personally censored for being heretical, for suggesting that the earth, the world that we live in, was created by a demiurge, by some sort of evil spirit. And Blood Meridian is a book that is grappling with this question of theodicy, of there are characters in this book who have opinions about the evil that they see, and they wonder about the evil of the universe. If we specifically look at the content of this quote, at least what I can discern from it, because it is hard to understand, I think there's something very apt and relevant to Blood Meridian. Blood Meridian is a book with no interiority, where the characters have no interiority. What I mean by that is that the characters in Blood Meridian are described in what they do and how they behave, and the landscape gets described in great detail, but there's no sense of inner experience, of a person's inner thoughts or inner emotions. And this is a pretty jarring and an interesting stylistic choice that Cormac McCarthy makes in this book. What I see in this quote, "The life of the darkness is not sunk in misery. Sorrow is a thing that is swallowed up in death. There is no sorrowing." There's a sense in this quote that there's a point of darkness, there's a point of evil which is so intense and so extreme that interiority, that sorrow, that human emotion almost becomes dismantled. It's no longer relevant. It's no longer visible anymore. And I think that ties in to the lack of interiority in this book.